and welcome to our special coverage of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. I am Ladi Akridumrale. The headlines. Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky meets with G7 leaders as they pledge their support for his country. U.S. Air Force carries out first fully successful test of air-launched hypersonic missile. And an unprecedented 100,000 United Kingdom nurses are said to walk off the job. The group of 7 leaders has pledged to give, quote, unwavering support and solidarity to Ukraine by promising assistance with military and air defense systems. U.S. President Joe Biden was one of the G7 who held a virtual meeting with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky. At that meeting, Mr. Zelensky outlined 3 steps for securing peace. The Ukrainian president asked member countries for more military equipment, including artillery, missiles, and modern tanks, and for a commitment to increase assistance to ensure financial, energy, and social stability next year. Mr. Zelensky also said Ukraine would like to offer a peace solution, beginning with asking Russia to start withdrawing troops this Christmas. Meanwhile, U.S. President Joe Biden says there are no plans to send U.S. troops to Ukraine. Following a question about whether his administration was planning on sending troops to Ukraine, Mr. Biden told reporters traveling with him in Virginia, quote, "Are we sending troops to Ukraine? No. We're sending material like we have millions of dollars worth." In November, the Biden administration called on Congress for additional funding to continue to support Ukraine. The Office of Management and Budget Director Shalanda Young had sent a letter to House Speaker Nancy Pelosi detailing a $37.7 billion request for Ukraine aid. And staying with the G7 meeting, the Ukrainian president has asked the group to help his government obtain an additional 2 billion cubic meters of natural gas and to supply it with modern tanks, artillery units and shells, as well as long-range weapons. Speaking remotely at the G7 video conference hosted by Germany, Mr. Zelensky also called on Russia to make a, quote, substantive step towards a diplomatic resolution of the war in Ukraine and suggested that Moscow should pull out its troops by Christmas.
Україна потребує сучасних танків. Я прошу вас відкрити цю оборонну можливість для нас.
Ukraine needs modern tanks, stable support of artillery with howitzer and rockets in order to prevent escalation from the Russian side. We need more response artillery, long-range rockets. The more effective we are with these weapons, the shorter the Russian aggression will be. I ask you to increase help for Ukraine with the provision of natural gas. We're talking about an additional 2 billion cubic meters of natural gas. This is the extra amount we need to buy. It will be right in time for this Christmas to start a withdrawal of Russian forces from the internationally recognized borders of Ukraine. If Russia conducts a withdrawal of its forces from Ukraine, then it will also ensure a reliable end of hostilities. I hope you support this appeal of ours, because it is in the global interest and a part of our formula for peace. I hope you support this appeal of ours, because it is in the global interest and a part of our formula for peace. The occupiers should leave, and no doubt it will happen. I see no reason why Russia should not do this now, in time for Christmas.
And the United States Air Force carried out the first successful test of its complete air-launched hypersonic missile, a program that had previously suffered a series of setbacks because of testing failures. A full prototype of the air-launched rapid response weapon, known in short as ARRW, was launched from a B-52 off the coast of California. The AGM-183A missile achieved hypersonic speeds more than 5 times the speed of sound, and it detonated in the terminal area. According to the Air Force, all of its objectives were met in the test. The ARRW is a boost glide missile that uses a booster rocket to accelerate a projectile to hypersonic speeds. A glide vehicle then separates from the booster and uses inertia to travel to its target at hypersonic speeds. This test was the first of the entire system, known as an all-up round test. Previous launches focused on the booster rockets. And Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky says Russia has not abandoned its plan of hitting Ukraine with airstrikes and seas power blackouts as its last hope. Ukraine's general staff says Russian missiles, artillery and drones hammered targets in eastern and southern Ukraine as global economic powers pledge to beef up Kiev's military capabilities with a focus on air defenses.
Бути свідомими того, що Росія не відмовилась від цієї своєї тактики.
We have to be aware that Russia has not abandoned this tactic of terror. Any absence of mass missile strikes simply means that the enemy is readying new attacks. Russia is still counting on blackout. This is the terrorists' last hope. Among other things, we must gather the maximum of global capabilities to overcome the Russian mind terror as soon as possible. And I thank once again all our partners who help. I thank all our heroic workers of the State Emergency Service, our police, and the military who carry out demining.
And French Prime Minister Elisabeth Borne met last night with the Ukrainian Prime Minister Denis Shmyhal in Paris. Ms. Borne and Mr. Shmyhal's meeting and working dinner comes on the eve of a high-level solidarity conference for Ukraine being organized by France. Mr. Shmyhal will meet with French President Emmanuel Macron at the Élysée Palace before attending the conference. He is also set to meet with France's foreign and finance ministers in Paris. And Poland's President Andrzej Duda says NATO countries can guarantee to Russia that they will not treat it in the same way Moscow is treating Ukraine. The Polish president made this known in response to a question about French President Emmanuel Macron's idea of security guarantees for Russia. A joint news conference with his German counterpart Frank-Walter Steinmeier saw Mr. Duda says, quote, "What we as honest people, politicians and NATO members are able to guarantee to Russia is that no one is going to do to Russia what she is doing to her neighbors." Mr. Duda adds that he told the German president that he should turn to the European Union and the European Commission and ask for financial support for those countries which take in refugees fleeing from the Russian invasion and destruction caused by the Russian army. Iran has carried out a second execution linked to anti-government protests engulfing the country. A court had convicted Majid Reza Ranavad of the charge of, quote, enmity against God after finding he had stabbed to death 2 members of the paramilitary Basij resistance force. The judiciary announced that he had been hanged in public early on Monday in the city of Mashhad. Human rights groups have warned that protesters are being sentenced to death after sham trials with no due process. The first execution took place last Thursday, triggering international condemnation of Mohsen Shakari, 33, who was convicted of enmity against God after being found to have attacked a Basij member with a machete in Tehran. And nurses in the United Kingdom have reached a breaking point. As many as 100,000 members of the Royal College of Nursing will walk out across England, Wales and Northern Ireland on Thursday, that's 2 days from now, in the first of 2 days of strikes this month to protest poor pay and working conditions. They plan to walk out again on December the 20th. However, nurses in Scotland are negotiating a separate pay offer. It's the first time in its 106-year history that the Royal College of Nursing, the UK's biggest nursing union, has gone on strike. The action has been sparked by a cost of living crisis that has slashed nurses' spending power nearly 3 years after the start of a pandemic that pushed many of them to the limits. Meanwhile, snow has blanketed London and large parts of the United Kingdom, shutting schools, grounding flights and causing widespread disruption across the country, struggling through a winter energy crisis. According to the Met Office, the UK's National Weather Service, Britain recorded the coldest day of the year during the early hours of yesterday, with temperatures as low as minus 15.7 degrees Celsius in northern Scotland. The cold snap left many parts of the country, including London, covered in snow from Sunday evening, causing the Met Office to issue severe weather warnings for some parts of the country. Let's talk now to Chidi Warnold, security expert, who joins us from the British capital, London. Morning to you, Chidi. How are you finding the weather? Okay, I see you taking possibly a warm beverage there. It's really cold, isn't it?
Yeah, good morning. Thanks for having me on. Yeah, it's a little bit chilly, but it's what we expect. It's winter, it's Northern Europe, it's cold. So it's snowy, we have train strikes. So, traveling, getting into work today is going to be a nightmare. But, this is Britain 2022, is what we expect.
There is, of course, what we just talked about, or what we've just been reading, about the nurses going off work as well. I mean, you just talked about the trains, and getting into work. Now the nurses are going to walk off work in about 48 hours' time. That's on Thursday for the very first time. How's that hitting home?
Well, it will be more, obviously problematic if you have a medical problem or a medical emergency. But when you're looking at it holistically, in terms of how it affects the whole country, it's indicative of the problems that the United Kingdom in particular is going through. And as much as maybe the politicians don't want to focus on it, it's a definite direct response to Brexit, how that affected, the working population. Many people from Eastern Europe left. The job market kind of contracted. So there's lots of vacancies, but there's not enough people who I would say maybe are British, native-born Britons living in Britain who can fill a lot of these vacancies. At the same time, the government has run out of money, so it can't implement widespread public sector pay increases across the board. It would cost a lot of money, which the government apparently doesn't have. And at the same time, we've got COVID, we've got the war in Ukraine, we've got multiple shocks, and also, most importantly, from a British political point of view, you've got a fairly weak government coming to the end of its term. It's not in a position to make any big kind of agreements that it can't sustain or it can't justify. So it's stuck between a rock and a hard place. But at the same time, it's not helping itself by not negotiating with them and trying to bring them on side. It's very much hands off, handing off the train strikes to the train companies, handing off the nurses' strikes to the NHS, to the individual NHS trusts, and more or less trying to stay out as if it's not involved.
Now, all of this, of course, as you pointed out, is linked in some way to a number of issues: COVID, Brexit, and then the war in Ukraine. But I guess the one that is ongoing right now is the war in Ukraine. And Britain, after America, Britain has been possibly the most front and center country in support of Ukraine. And yet we have no indication that the war is going to end anytime soon. There is the proposal from Mr. Zelensky, the president of Ukraine, detailing some steps that the Russians could take ahead of Christmas. That doesn't seem to be going anywhere, because just a couple of days ago, you had the Russian president saying, yeah, peace, but possibly in the future, nothing present. It does look bleak.
Yeah, it's, when we're talking about the weather, and, I was just thinking the other day, I think, as I said last time, as somebody who's, done military operations in the cold weather, it's not pleasant. And I was thinking the other day about, how we are now, we're complaining about the cold, but there's boys out there sitting in trenches in freezing weather, it's not pleasant. It's some of the most horrible conditions you can think of. And they were sitting there under artillery fire, under machine gun fire, over something that is going to end one day with a negotiation. It's very, very unfortunate. But to answer your central question, no, there is no indication of peace, because neither side is willing to accept the conditions laid down by the other. The Russians haven't offered any concessions. They've escalated at every step. They've annexed Ukrainian territory. They've continued attacking Ukraine. They've attacked their critical infrastructure. They've continued their very strange offensive in backwoods. There's nothing that the Russians are offering. So there's nothing that we would expect from that side. The Ukrainians on their side as well are not offering anything, because from their perspective, they're defending their country, they're liberating their territory. So the only offer they're giving, as you saw from Zelensky's speech, is that the Russians should withdraw. So neither side is going to concede. The war will continue. What we're seeing over winter so far is both sides understand that each of them needs space to reconstitute their forces. The Ukrainians need space to build back their forces after the Kherson and Kharkiv offensives. The Russians need space to build back their forces after the amount of losses they've taken. If the Ukrainians don't continue putting up resistance, so for example, holding on to Bakhmut, forcing the Russians to fight there, then that gives the Russians that operational space to rebuild their forces and launch an offensive. At the same time, if the Russians relax and leave the Ukrainians, they'll be able to bring back all their forces that they finished using in Kherson, in Kharkiv, all the forces that have been trained out in the UK and in Europe, bring them in, reconstitute them into forces and go on the offensive again. The Ukrainians are better prepared for winter because they've been very well supported by their Western allies with a lot of warm weather kit, generators, tents, thermal clothing, all the good stuff that you need, to make this really horrible weather bearable. But without that operational pause in order to reconstitute their forces and additional, support weapons, artillery, etc., it's going to be very difficult for them to do what they most likely plan to do, which is conduct a limited winter offensive.
Now, as you did reference that, the last time you and I spoke, you talked about the difficulty, and I remember that just, I believe it was yesterday, the Ukrainian defense minister was saying, look, we're going to have to halt our offensive because the ground is quite wet, and when it gets frozen, then perhaps we'll be able to move. But as it is right now, tracked vehicles are not able to move, and that means a great deal of number of tanks and all of that. This is presumably the same position that the Russians will find themselves in any attempt to defend or counter any of the offensives coming from the Ukrainians. But then that brings me to the issue of the G7. Up until now, 10 months or so into the war, the G7 had resisted handing over air defense systems to Ukraine. But it does seem as if they're shifting on that position. What do you think is responsible for that, and what kind of danger could it present if such sophisticated weapons handed over to Ukraine then end up in third-party hands, which was the reason why the owners were reluctant to let go of them in the first place?
So so there's several elements. The first is the G7 not being willing to hand over these weapons. There were several issues. The first is, in reality, NATO, particularly Britain, doesn't have that many anti-air weapons. What we've handed over, the most dangerous weapons that we can hand over are the manpads, the shoulder-launched anti-air weapons, because they're portable, they're very good weapons for anybody, for criminals, terrorists. So those are the ones that are most at risk, and ironically, those are the ones that have been handed over in the largest quantities. What we're talking about now, again, is short-range to medium-range air defense systems. These are most likely tracked, or some of them will be stationary. Some of them to provide point defense, and some to protect the units that are in battle. Now, a lot of the reluctance, as I said, is due to the fact there's not that many of them, and also they don't want them captured by the Russians. But the Russians actually did, the Ukrainians a great favor by attacking their electrical system. That took away kind of a lot of the arguments against, and gave a moral imperative to the G7, to NATO and Ukrainian allies to provide these weapon systems. Will they be decisive? No, because a lot of them will be used to defend Ukrainian critical national infrastructure. Some of them are already on the front line defending, the forward troops, but it doesn't necessarily do much other than to blunt the Russian, strategic weapon of attacking the critical national infrastructure. And maybe one added benefit is that because what Ukrainian systems they have so far have been, used up quite badly trying to counter this Russian attacks on their electrical system. That might have freed up the Russian Air Force, although the Russian Air Force doesn't function very well in bad weather. But it might have freed up the Russian Air Force to, strike deeper into Ukraine with its fighter ground attack aircraft. With this additional ground-based air defense being provided to Ukraine, that kind of prevents that or limits it a little bit. So the conclusion is that it maintains the status quo, even though, both sides have kind of escalated a little bit. It still maintains that balance of power. It doesn't give one side a greater advantage over the other.
Now, we're also hearing this morning about this brand new weapon that the United States has just tested. It's had a bit of setback in the past. And you and I have talked about hypersonic missiles, although at that time we're talking about them from the viewpoint of the Russians, because the Russians already have hypersonic missiles. But now the information is out that the United States also has has tested this now. What is the importance of this weapon, and could it potentially play a decisive turn should, for example, the Americans decide to hand over one or two of these to the Ukrainians, or perhaps the Russians deploy theirs to the conflict?
It's a very useful weapon from the point of conducting standoff kind of air attacks. The probability of it ever being handed over to the Ukrainians is, I would say, almost zero, because A, they wouldn't have the right aircraft to deploy it, and it's such a sensitive piece of equipment that the Americans wouldn't let anybody else have it. And also, more importantly, we're still in the testing phase. We haven't got to the production model, so whatever's being tested now is not going to be exactly the same. Maybe physically it will look the same, but from its programming and its internal mechanics, it's not going to be the same as a production missile. From this, they'll take away all the information from the tests, and then they'll, refine it and get ready, and then start the production later on down the line. So, in terms of an immediate operational effect, no. But what it is, I mean, these tests are generally planned far in advance, so it's coincidental, but it's good strategic messaging from the American point of view. This is a way for them to tell the Russians, we have the ability to, strike you where we want, when we want, if we choose to, once we've got this weapon system prepared. At the same time, you see they've unveiled their new stealth bomber, the B-21. All of this builds into the calculus. Everybody looking at them from Russia, China, Iran, fair enough, they'll understand that these weapon systems are not ready to go now, but they know that in 1 year, 2 years, 3 years, they've now got to factor in that this is what the Americans can bring to the party, and they've got to bear that in mind. But in terms of this war, it will not be, it won't be, you won't be seeing it, hopefully.
All right, then, Chidi, yet another grim prediction. It's possible that we might be able to talk before the Christmas festivities. If not, do have yourself a wonderful Christmas season, and thank you for your time.
Same to you. Thank you very much.
And after the break, President Recep Tayyip Erdogan of Turkey reveals new oil field worth $12 billion. Details in a moment. Please stay with us. Thanks for staying tuned. Welcome back. It's been 9 months, 6 weeks, and 2 days since Russia attacked Ukraine. The ensuing war has led to a shift in Western alliances, particularly with regards to energy needs. This singular event is now bringing more traffic into the Middle East, a region rich in oil and gas. But the world has its eyes on the Middle Eastern countries to see how it has responded to both the politics and the economics of the shifting alliances. Our correspondent Mayowa Adegoke helps us understand this better in her report from Dubai in the UAE.
The Russia-Ukraine war has changed the dynamics of gas supply into mainland Europe and oil supply globally. With sanctions placed on Russia, there is a scramble by European countries to find new energy partners, keeping in mind the potential threat that Russia, one of the top 3 gas suppliers globally, may decide to shut down operations in retaliation, exposing Western Europe to endure a cold winter.
Gas is needed to heat homes. Gas is needed for industrial purposes beyond just heating up homes. Gas is needed for many, many things. It's needed for power and across many countries. There are countries in Europe where 100% of their gas comes from, or maybe came from, Russia before the war.
This surge has opened new doors of market for Middle Eastern countries, particularly Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and the United Arab Emirates. Both Saudi and UAE hold a significant sway in OPEC and have resisted Western pressure to cut ties with Russia and increase oil production to mitigate high prices of crude. The problem with producing more is it will further weaken the position of Russia and China, both strong partners of the Middle Eastern countries. So if the Middle East is sitting on the fence, why then is there a ramp-up in production, particularly gas?
Spare capacity in our industry is something that you work towards. You invest, in the production systems, in the exploration, in having a viable and a thriving industry. It takes a lot of work, a lot of long-term planning, strategy, and intent to build that capacity for the rainy day.
Recently, Germany signed a long-term record-breaking gas deal with Qatar and another with the UAE, which will make a first delivery of 137,000 cubic meters of liquefied natural gas later this year. In a separate arrangement, UAE will also send Austria 0.1 billion cubic meters of LNG, enough for the consumption of around 65,000 households with gas heating, covering about 1% of the country's total gas consumption. Across the Middle East, there are plans to ramp up production. Oil-rich UAE, while a relatively modest gas exporter, has plans to double its LNG production to 12 million tons a year by 2026.
On a strategic level, why would they commit billions of dollars to doing that? It has to be that they've taken an outlook that, you know what, oil and gas is still going to be with us for quite a while. So let me give you an example. ADNOC, which is the national oil company of Abu Dhabi, so far this year has invested about $6 billion in drilling. You don't drill if you're not looking for oil, or if you don't believe that oil will be there or hydrocarbon will be there. So that means, in spite of everything else, they are taking an all of the above strategy for all the energy that they want to supply to the world.
All in all, while events that have led here are unfortunate, countries that have invested in infrastructure are now benefiting from the opportunities available. From Dubai in the United Arab Emirates, Mayowa Adegoke for Channels Television.
All right, now let's talk to Mayowa herself for more on this shift in alliances. Hi, Mayowa, nice to see you.
Likewise, so good to see you.
Let's take a look at this mix of politics and economics that your report emphasizes, especially as it relates to the Gulf states. Is it that the Gulf states have tended to put aside the politics of what's going on and focused on the economics? Is that the way it's been read?
Well, I'd say that no one, apart from these governments themselves, can tell exactly what it boils down to. Is it politics? Is it economics? However, Shola, analyst there who has spent many years working in the UAE energy sector at high levels, right? We had nearly 2 hours of a conversation about all of this, analyzing events in the past few months. And one can safely say that it's a mix of different things. So foreign policy, internal energy strategy and politics, trade, all of these eventually play a role in politics at the end of the day. We can definitely say that the Gulf's approach to global politics is also at play. This is a classic case of your enemy is not always my enemy. And from history, we do know that UAE's stance has always tilted towards having more friends rather than enemies. And that's paid off in some ways. Just a few days ago, the UAE and Saudi successfully mediated a prisoner swap between America and Russia. And that would have been a bit more difficult if either of those countries weren't neutral. Right. So also, we've read comments from top UAE government officials saying that this newfound interest is all well and good, but it should not just be transactional. The UAE needs assurances from the West. It needs it to pay attention to security threats from Iran, particularly with what they call the Iranian drones. And it needs the West to give explicit security assurances. So as much as, yes, the trade is good, the economics are good, it also is looking at politics and security.
Now, the role of OPEC, of course, I mean, you and I both know that the role of OPEC is to benefit its members. And all these Gulf states are members of OPEC. And you've got Russia as a member of OPEC, which you referenced in your report. President Xi of China has just left Saudi Arabia after a very high-profile visit. But can you say that the situation as we find it has already started to benefit the local economies in the Gulf states, including where you are?
So with regards to Saudi, analysts say that this is a relationship that's been 6 years in the making. It's been growing steadily for over 6 years. And this visit really is the cherry on top. More business, more trade, as we see everything happening around the same season. Definitely the crisis has catalyzed a lot, and that's how we see all of these things happening all at once. Trade is great for the region, right? But when it also comes to positioning itself, that's with regards to Saudi, the UAE, and all the other countries, positioning themselves as a global force to reckon with diplomatically and otherwise, this is definitely one statement that they're making, and they're doing a good job of making it as well. This particular visit to Saudi has already resulted in $50 billion worth of investment agreements. So that's definitely ching in the bank. Also, from the look of things, Saudi and China's relationship will only get stronger. Remember that China is the world's biggest buyer of oil, and Saudi is its top supplier. So across board, the UAE and China's relationship also growing. You know, from what we see, that's not looking good for Iran. Iran doesn't like that. So all in all, we see the Gulf states making a bold statement this year in particular, telling the West that, hey, we have our sovereignty, we can decide where our alliances go. And honestly, they just want to keep everybody as friends, right? We don't have to choose sides, and we will only go for what works for us. So if the West doesn't really want to understand what the Gulf states are asking, especially with regards to security and some other things, then we might as well make new friends and strengthen those friendships. And that's what we see playing out here.
I can't let you go without asking about the daily activities. I mean, against the backdrop of what we've been talking about, the war in Ukraine and this movement in alliances and all of that, the World Cup is in neighboring Qatar from where you are. What's everyday life like against the backdrop of an event like that? And how are people coping having this looming cloud, if you like, of the war in Ukraine in the background, even with all the things that are happening in that area?
You know, ultimately, permit me to speak my mother tongue, Yoruba. They say that any con lomo. So sometimes some of these issues globally that, you know, sort of we talk about a lot in the news, it's only those who it affects. Those are the ones who really feel it. I can tell you that some people, you know, they don't really remember that, oh, this war is still going on. And so for some football lovers, it's like party as usual. With regards to FIFA, the World Cup, it's a huge buzz in Dubai, across the UAE. It really does feel like we're just next door. You've got an average of 17 flights from Dubai to Qatar daily. I can literally snap my fingers and it's like off to the airport and I'll be there in an hour, 10 minutes. It's a lot of buzz, fan zones spread across the city. You even have a lot of entertainment, live screens. People can watch these things live. Plus, let's not forget that this is the first World Cup in any Arab nation. So that excitement is spread across everyone here, even though we're not Arabs, for instance. We all are just caught up in that excitement. You've got restaurants, fast food chains creating special menus. It's a lot of excitement. And I just say that the best place to be for the World Cup is Qatar, obviously. But the next place to be is Dubai in the UAE. You want to experience the World Cup.
At that point, I guess I should say that I do envy you being in the very next best place. I do enjoy the rest of the tournament. We will catch it up on the screens as we have since it started. But thank you, Maiwa, for your time this morning. It's good that you've been able to break this down for us. Thank you.
Thank you for having me.
And when we return, the White House says it will engage with Russia to discuss Paul Whelan's release this week. Please stay with us. Thanks for staying tuned and welcome back. About 150 million barrels of oil reserves have been discovered in a Gaba mountain in Turkey's southern province of Sırnak. The president, Recep Tayyip Erdogan, announced this following a meeting with his cabinet of ministers. The president stated that the find, said to be one of the 10 largest onshore discoveries of 2022, is worth about $12 billion. Mr. Erdogan says, quote, "We produce 5,000 barrels per day in 4 wells in this region, which have a very high oil quality." While many oil and natural gas companies were throwing in the towel during the pandemic, Turkish Petroleum accelerated its exploration and production activities. He adds that with 34 more discoveries in 2021 alone, Turkey has added another 71 million barrels to its current reserves. And from there, let's talk to Ini John McQuarrie, who was more about a business. Big one for Turkey there.
Yes, big one at a time like this. It will really boost them. You know, we've talked about how their currency has weakened, their economy.
They have huge inflation and all that.
Exactly. So this could really help at a time when countries are trying to win off Russia, oil and other fossil fuels.
Yes, and Maiwa, who was on before you, was talking about the fact that somebody is your enemy doesn't make the person my enemy. Turkey has played that very well.
Yes.
And talking about friends, Belarus is to be given permission to fish in Russian waters.
Yes.
Talk about friendship.
Yes, that's friendship. I mean, the world is hating on Belarus now, and Belarus is not a very big economy on its own. So for them to stake out and take the risk of supporting Russia so much, I mean, they are home to Russian soldiers and they assist in everywhere, sometimes even sending soldiers to assist. So, I mean, they just have to get compensation in one way. That's what Russia is trying to do, that they can now fish in Russian waters, and of course that will boost their economy. And you know, unlike like here in Nigeria, where we import most of our edibles, even if it's fish and all of that, for European countries, they eat what they produce. So even yesterday, the EU ministers had a meeting also talking about fishing rights and all of that. They do that every year to find out, okay, what state are we at, so that we don't deplete the waters. So they're very conscious of things like that. So this comes as a great relief for Belarus to have that right to fish. It will fit the people and also give them a bit of revenue.
And we're still talking about friendship, but this time on the other side.
The other side.
People deemed unfriendly to Russia, investors.
When you are not friends with Russia, you have to pay for it. So Belarus is friends with Russia.
And it's getting the reward.
And they're getting it. When you're not friends with Russia, you pay for it. So people who had seen Russia before the war, they had seen it as a good ground for investment. And we know Russia is very developed. They've developed their oil and gas companies very well. They've developed their minerals, gold. So in spite of all of these sanctions, we see that they're still making money from some of this.
Absolutely.
But Russia is saying that we're still making money in spite of the sanctions, but if you are unfriendly to us, you will not be part of that money. So if you have a stake, if you're a shareholder in companies that deal with submarine resources, oil and gas, gold, everything under the earth, you will not get dividends, you will not get you won't be part of the meeting, you won't be part of decisions of companies that you have invested your money in. So that, and it was supposed to.
So you'll still be frozen out, basically.
Yeah, well, if Russia's reserve is frozen, then they might as well be frozen. So the thing is, it was supposed to end by December, this December 2023. But they had a meeting yesterday, and they've decided to extend it to December next year. So
that's
but you know,
good.
there are some unclear parts, and that is that. Are we saying that as a shareholder, my dividends is not being paid, I'm not getting part of the profit? Is it being piled up for me for when the war is over and we are now friends?
Or has it been seized? Like the planes and the other things that were seized at the start of the war?
Exactly. So that is unclear at this time, and investors just have to...
Wait and see.
Exactly.
Now, the ruble... we're waiting for inflation figures from Russia. And you and I have discussed this all through this conflict, the last 3 quarters. Once those inflation figures come out, there tends to be an almost immediate reaction.
Yeah, this week is very specific. I tell you, by Friday, we're going to see a lot of changes because the inflation is supposed to come out. The ruble weakened because of pressure of inflation. So even though Russia is good at managing it, but it's still in the world. So that means you still get pressured in. So this week, we have a lot of data coming forth. From Russia, we're expecting inflation by Friday. In the U.S., we're expecting inflation today. Tomorrow, the FOMC meeting, that's their MPC, they are meeting tomorrow. And then from England, the Bank of England, that's the UK, we're expecting, yesterday we saw a little bit of good news coming from the UK that they're back to growth rate, even though it's small, 0.5%. But at least maybe we might escape, we might escape that recession. Very big maybe, very big maybe. We're expecting also inflation from the US and maybe their meetings, that's like the MPC, FOMC, may not increase the interest rate as much, not that they will not increase, but maybe not as much as. Maybe they might leave that 0.75 they've been doing and just do 0.5%. That's what's been expected.
Laddie has been singing that song since last week, so I hear you singing it again this week. And I'm
that's why we put that big maybe signpost the maybe everywhere. But I mean, it might just be that the world or investors are beginning to adjust to the new normal, you know, so we don't hear central banks threatening us with very harsh hike in interest rate as it was when the war just started. Perhaps the world and the economies are beginning to adjust just a little bit. So things are not as they used to be, but maybe not as harsh as it was when the war started.
Time. Yes, indeed. Thank you, Ini. Of course, Ini will have more of this right after this on Business Morning and later on Business Incorporated. But for now, thanks.
Thank you for having me.
The International Energy Agency says the European Union has enough gas for the winter but could face a shortage next year if Russia cuts supplies further, urging governments to act faster to save energy and expand renewables. The head of the agency, Fatih Birol, warned that the crisis is not over and said shortages may occur in 2023 rather than 2022 as the 27-member bloc stored enough supply to get through this winter. Despite Russia slashing gas deliveries this year, Europe has averted a severe shortage and started the winter with brimming gas storage tanks, thanks in part to emergency EU measures to fill storage, plus a lucky spell of mild weather and high gas prices that dampened the demands for fuel. National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan says the White House remains, quote, bound and determined to ensure that it works through a successful method of securing Paul Whelan's release at the earliest possible opportunity. Even as he acknowledged that over the last several months, it's become apparent that what Russia was asking for to secure Mr. Whelan's release was not something that we had been able to give. Mr. Sullivan says that is a problem we're trying to solve. We have various ways that we're working through solutions, and we will be endeavoring on a daily basis from the president on down to finally develop a formula that works. Mr. Sullivan adds that administration officials will have an engagement with the Russian Federation this week to address Mr. Whelan's case. Freed Russian arms dealer Victor Bout, who was exchanged in a prisoner swap with WBA star Brittany Griner, has joined the pro-Kremlin ultra-nationalist party, the Liberal Democratic Party of Russia, and that's according to state media. Mr. Bout says, quote, I am deeply touched by the honor, and naturally I'm very nervous to be in the spotlight as he accepted his membership card from the party leader, Leonid Slutsky. Mr. Bout adds that Leonid Eduardovich Slutsky has done a lot to free me. Liberal Democratic Party of Russia strongly supported me. It is my honor. It's my duty to do all I can, not only to help, but also to be actively involved in the work of the party. Mr. Bout, nicknamed the Merchant of Death by his accusers, was released on Thursday from U.S. detention while serving a 25-year prison sentence on charges of conspiring to kill Americans, acquire and export anti-aircraft missiles, and provide material support to a terrorist organization. The U.S. Olympic and Paralympic Committee have backed moves to allow athletes from Russia and Belarus to compete at the 2024 Paris Olympics, provided they do not participate under their country's colors or flags. U.S. officials said that there was unanimous interest amongst delegates to an International Olympic Committee summit to come up with a pathway that would allow athletes from Russia and Belarus to return to competition. The two countries have been isolated from international sport ever since Russia launched its invasion of Ukraine in February. U.S. Olympic and Paralympic Committee President Suzanne Leon said Olympic officials wanted Russian and Belarusian athletes to have the chance to compete as neutrals in order to avoid a return to the boycotts of the 70s and 80s. And finally, on the program, the International Federation of Volleyball has refused to pay any compensation to the Russian side after the 2022 Volleyball Men's World Championships in Russia was cancelled. The FIVB announced a decision on March the 1st to relocate the previously scheduled 2022 Volleyball Men's World Championships in Russia to co-host countries Poland and Slovenia, citing the developments in Ukraine as the reason. The Secretary General of the Russian Volleyball Federation, Alexander Yaremenko, said FIVB's stance was the reason Russia lodged a lawsuit with a Swiss court against the world's governing volleyball body, demanding compensation in the amount of $80 million over the relocation of the World Championships. And that's where we anchor the program this morning. Thanks for being with us. My name is Vladi Akiri, with our lady updates throughout the day, but particularly within the world today at 5 to watch out for that. For now, you have a pleasant day ahead. Good morning.